Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard talked about the teleological suspension of the ethical. He had in mind religious contexts in which ethical norms are set aside due to a direct command from God. Now we're going to talk about a much more prosaic sort of case where there might be some reason to believe that ethical norms are suspended, or at least that they are shifted, they're moved around. It is similarly a teleological suspension, or a teleological shift. But in this case, it's a business goal, not a religious goal. So as I said, it's much more prosaic. Albert Carr, in a famous essay, argues that within business contexts, ethical norms change. Now, it's not as if anything goes, they shift rather than simply disappear. But what happens is that a lot of things that might be unethical in ordinary contexts become ethical in a business context. In particular, he's arguing that bluffing, and to some extent, well, not only misleading people and withholding information that's important to them, but maybe even direct lying, is legitimate as long as it serves a business purpose. Now, I think there's something interesting going on here, and so I want to talk about this, both in terms of Carr's arguments, but also in a broader ethical context to understand whether there are situations that shift ethical norms, and if so, what those situations are like and what we ought to say about them. Carr's basic point is that there are certain kinds of contexts where truth is not expected. He quotes Henry Taylor as saying, "Falsehood ceases to be falsehood when it's understood on all sides that the truth is not expected to be spoken." Now, there are all sorts of contexts like that, where the truth is really not expected to be spoken. Fiction is the most obvious one. Pick up a work of fiction, you do not expect that the person is telling you the truth. Some novels are based on actual historical events, but most are not. And so there's a big difference between a book that is nonfiction, that's trying to report what actually happened, and a work of fiction. Open up Robert Southey's Story of the Three Bears, for example, and it goes like this. Once upon a time, there were three bears who lived together in a wood. Well, we don't then evaluate the story and begin demanding, well, wait, there are three bears, they live in a cottage, they eat porridge, what is this? That would be completely inappropriate. We don't expect the truth. Now, fictional contexts are obviously pretty irrelevant to thinking about business. However, there is something important that we might get from this, because there are other contexts too, where it looks as if people do not expect the truth. In a legal context, for example, the attorneys on both sides are trying to present the best case for their client. They are not impartially trying to gather the truth. They are trying to present one side, and it's their job to do that. Similarly, a defendant who is being arraigned in a criminal court pleads guilty or not guilty, but we don't necessarily hold them to the truth in the way that we would if they were giving testimony. We would tend to say that somebody who changes their plea from guilty to not guilty, or from not guilty to guilty, is not thereby liable to being charged with perjury. Why? Because that's not a context where somebody is appearing under oath, where we fully expect the truth. We expect people to present the best side that they can for themselves, and that may or may not involve telling the truth about the actual plea. In fact, the entire institution of plea bargaining rests on the idea that sometimes people will plead guilty to offenses they did not commit in order to avoid being charged with a more serious offense and risk going to jail for that. Our question is the extent to which that applies to business. And Carr thinks it applies significantly, specifically in bargaining or negotiation type contexts where people are expected to engage in a certain amount of bluffing. You might think that in a context like that, the buyer is trying to get the lowest price possible, the seller is trying to get the highest price possible, and neither one is going to be entirely blunt about, well, what we could call the reservation price. If I am trying to buy a car, for example, I don't typically want to reveal my reservation price, the highest price I'd be willing to pay for that car. And the seller does not typically want to reveal his reservation price, the lowest price he would accept for that car. And so we engage in a bit of back and forth. Now, I've got to say, I am terrible at this. I'm usually rather honest about my reservation price, which is not a great negotiating strategy, and which actually often has, in the past, derailed a negotiation, because people assume in this kind of negotiation context that people are not telling the truth. And if you say, quite frankly, look, here's the most I want to spend, I've found that a lot of people keep showing you things just a bit above that because they think, oh, you're lying, you're really willing to spend more. But if you're telling the truth, well, it turns out you're not expected to tell the truth in that context, and it sets the negotiation off on completely the wrong foot. In fact, they're going to show you things that really are out of your price range, and so it's never probably going to start in the first place. So I think Carr is right that in this kind of negotiation or bargaining context, we don't really expect the truth. And when somebody does just bluntly state the truth, as I often have, it turns out that it kind of throws people off. All of a sudden, things get confused because they don't expect you to be telling the truth. The point here, then, is that the buyer and seller in this type of situation don't want to reveal their own reservation price. They don't want to answer the question truthfully, what's the highest price you're willing to pay? Or what's the lowest price you're willing to sell me the car for? And each is trying to find out the other's reservation price without revealing their own. In fact, hiding or maybe even misrepresenting their own. Now, that isn't ordinarily considered unethical. That's something that's part of the game. And that analogy with games is something that Carr makes a lot of. He says, in poker, people expect that there's a certain amount of misrepresentation. Hiding information, yes, of course, but also misrepresenting and bluffing, trying to make people form the wrong belief about how strong your hand is. The same is true in all sorts of other games. People do not reveal all sorts of information. In fact, often they actually mislead people. They are doing the equivalent of telling a lie. Think about a hockey player performing a deke, trying to fake out the defense. Or imagine a basketball player similarly engaging in a stutter step or otherwise trying to feint, and so mislead the defender. The same thing happens in baseball. The pitcher not only tries to hide the ball so that the batter can't see the grip, which might give a clue about the pitch coming in, but that pitch may well be a curveball or a slider or a changeup or something else that has deception as its very goal. In football, too, the quarterback may look to the right and then pass to the left, may even do a pump fake and then throw the ball. And why is that happening? Trying to mislead, trying to deceive the defense. Similarly, the defense may look as if they're about to blitz and then not do it, or may act as if they're not and then suddenly blitz in order to try to throw the offense off its game. In chess, people will sometimes make moves, purposely sacrificing pieces in order to mislead the opponent about the strategy they're pursuing. And of course, in military contexts, this happens all the time. Famously, Eisenhower figured out where the Germans were expecting the Normandy invasion to go and sent some soldiers there as a fake while the main force hit the beaches in Normandy. So this sort of deception is routine in all sorts of competitive contexts. And that, I think, is the larger point. If we think about pure competition, and I'm going to talk about that in a separate video, but in situations of pure competition, what it comes down to is frequently the only Nash equilibrium is a mixed strategy. It's a mixed strategy equilibrium. And what happens in that kind of situation is that you are mixing up your strategy, your play, in order to keep the other player off balance. You don't want the other player to know what you're going to do. And that's common in competitive contexts. Well, a lot of business settings are competitive. And so similarly, you don't want your competition, or you don't want the person who's involved in the negotiation with you to know what you're up to. In fact, you want to deceive them, you want to mislead them. And so in situations of competition of that kind, we tend to think that certain things that would be unacceptable in other kinds of relationships become acceptable. Now again, to stress, the point is not that all's fair in love and war and business. Ethical norms do not disappear. The lines do not go away, but they move, they shift. Certain things become acceptable that would not be acceptable otherwise. So let's think a little bit about that. Think about a different kind of context, a job interview, for example. There are certain things you're really not expected to tell the truth about. There are other things you are. You had better tell the truth about your academic qualifications, for example, or your job history. But there are certain kind of things you don't have to reveal. In fact, there are certain things that it would be illegal to ask you. But let's get back to bargaining. Thomas Schelling wrote a famous paper, an essay on bargaining, in which he outlined how broad this is, how much of business activity it covers, and how useful it is in other kinds of contexts in life as well. He says, for example, in economics, the subject covers wage negotiations, tariff negotiations, competition where competitors are few, settlements out of court, and the real estate agent and his customer. Outside economics, it ranges from the threat of massive retaliation to taking the right away from a taxi. So there are many different kinds of contexts where we might think ethical norms shift, where the usual practices do not fully apply. Well, I've talked about bluffing, I've talked about deception, misleading, withholding information. But as Schelling points out, there's much more going on than that. It's actually quite a subtle sort of situation, and the interactions that go on in contract negotiations, in other forms of bargaining, are really quite complex. So, to return to his essay, bargaining power has been described as the power to fool and bluff, the ability to set the best price for yourself and fool the other man into thinking this was your maximum offer. That's from J.N. Morgan in 1949. Fooling and bluffing are certainly involved, but there are two kinds of fooling. One is deceiving about the facts. A buyer may lie about his income or misrepresent the size of his family. The other is purely tactical. Suppose each knows everything about the other and each knows what the other knows. What is there to fool about? The buyer may say that though he'd really pay up to 20 and the seller knows it, he's firmly resolved as a tactical matter not to budge above 16. If the seller capitulates, was he fooled? Or was he convinced of the truth? Or did the buyer really not know what he'd do next if the tactic failed? If the buyer really feels himself firmly resolved and bases his resolve on the conviction that the seller will capitulate, and the seller does, the buyer may afterwards say that he was not fooling. Whatever has occurred, it's not adequately conveyed by the notions of bluffing and fooling. I think there are several really interesting things going on in that paragraph, and one of them is that often the people involved in the negotiation do not themselves know their own reservation price. So it's one thing to say, well, yes, I've got this highest price that I'm willing to pay, and I go into the negotiation knowing precisely what it is, but of course I don't want the other person to know precisely what that is, and so I hide it, I may misrepresent it, and so on. I may give misleading clues about it. But I may not even know what that is. In fact, often in auction situations, people end up paying more than they had intended for something. In some cases, they even pay more at the auction than they would have paid for the buy it now price on eBay, for example. It's easy to get drawn up into the excitement. It's easy to lose your bearings and really not have that clear an idea of what your reservation price is in the first place. I think my reservation price is this, but then I bid higher. What's going on here? And one way of understanding it is that, well, I really ended up succumbing to weakness of will and not doing something I actually spent more than my reservation price. And that's quite possible. But another thing is that I may simply have gone in there not having a very clear idea of what my reservation price was. I thought I knew, turned out I didn't really. And sometimes I may have no idea at all. What's the highest price you would be willing to pay for a pair of glasses, for example? I don't know. And I'm pretty experienced with buying pairs of glasses. And so there are plenty of cases where simply I don't know. I wouldn't know what my highest price is. In other cases, of course, if I'm thinking about buying a house or buying an automobile, I may have a pretty clear idea. To return to Carr's argument, he thinks that certain kinds of contexts, including these sorts of bargaining, negotiation contexts, are ones that shift ethical norms. Now, it is not as if anything goes. I can't misrepresent my product, for example. I can't lie about it. I can't hide hidden defects in the house that I'm selling. There are other things I can't do. I'm applying for the mortgage. I can't lie about my income. And so there are various things that still apply. I'm not allowed to lie about just anything at all. But things that Schelling describes as tactical misrepresentations, those seem morally acceptable. If somebody comes right out and says, "What's the highest price you'd be willing to pay for this car?" I don't have to answer truthfully. In fact, I may say I don't know when really I do. I may give a number that's lower than what I really would be willing to pay, assuming that that's a starting point for negotiation. And so there is not, in certain kinds of contexts and with respect to certain kinds of claims, an expectation of truth. In competition, ethical norms that would ordinarily apply are suspended. Not all ethical norms are, but the ethical norms do shift. Not all lies become acceptable. Not all forms of deception are okay. And that's true in games in general. In poker, I can try to mislead people about the strength of my hand, but I can't pull aces out of my sleeve, for example, or refuse to show my cards and insist that I have a royal flush. I cannot, in baseball, throw a spitball, for example. Those things are unacceptable. So there are forms of deception that are okay, but other forms of deception that are not. And the same thing is true even in warfare. Certain things like pretending to attack one point when you're really sending your main force against another, that's viewed as great generalship. But pretending to surrender, for example, and then suddenly shooting people when they come out to capture you, that's not considered acceptable. So there are certain kinds of things in warfare that are viewed as ethical that would not be ethical otherwise, but not everything becomes ethical. Not even all deception becomes ethical. Now, Carr goes well beyond this. He argues that the only ethical boundary that remains in business is to follow the law. And so he isn't simply claiming that things shift. He says now ethics in effect just blends into the requirements of the law. It's important to remember that the ethical norms associated with the law and those associated with ethics proper are different things. We may have a law that prohibits something that's perfectly okay from a moral point of view, and we may have things that are immoral that are acceptable under the law. Well, Carr is then making a bold claim. He's saying that the only thing that somebody has to be worried about in business ethics is whether or not what they're doing is in keeping with the law. Are you violating the law? If you are, bad, stop doing it. But is this compatible with the law? Then it's fine. And that's much stronger than saying there's some ethical suspension of norms or an ethical shift. He's in effect saying ethics goes away except to say you should follow the law. And that's a very bold claim. Carr says that as long as a company doesn't transgress the rules of the game set by law, it has the legal right to shape its strategy without reference to anything but profits. If it takes a long-term view of its profits, it will preserve amicable relations so far as possible with those with whom it deals. A wise businessman will not seek advantage to the point where he generates dangerous hostility among employees, competitors, customers, government, or the public at large. But decisions in this area are, in the final test, decisions of strategy, not of ethics. So the only norms that are left really are legal norms. Otherwise, ethics is out the window. Now, I've said that's a strong claim, and he gives some examples that illustrate just how strong it is. He says, look, the use of harmful additives, producing unsafe products, as long as it's not against the law, it's perfectly okay. Now, I think most of us recoil from that and say, well, that's surely not okay. No, you can't purposely put things into your product that are going to harm people's health just because it's a bit cheaper, when those things, aren't against the law, but let's say you know they're harmful to health, and then you put them in anyway, surely that's immoral. Carr doesn't think so. But I think that's an extreme position. He's in effect saying, look, I'm not saying the norms go away, but actually they kind of do. The only thing that's left is the law. Now, I think a better way of approaching this question would be to talk about an ethical shift rather than simply an ethical suspension. We do not, in business contexts, suspend ethical norms, but they do change. The boundaries shift. Things that would be viewed as unacceptable become acceptable. They move across the line. As I've said, you cannot deceive people about your income in applying for a mortgage or your job, for example. You can't deceive people about product defects when you're in a sales situation. I can't, in effect, deceive someone who is a seller by writing a bad check. That sort of fraud is clearly unacceptable. And it's unacceptable even if the law hasn't gotten around to prohibiting it in this specific context. So I think Carr is wrong about that. But there's a broader point that I want to examine here, because it's easy enough to say, okay, he's right, that, at least with tactical misrepresentation, that becomes acceptable when it wasn't acceptable before. But with respect to other kinds of norms, no, they're still in place. They don't go away. You have an obligation not to harm others, even in situations where the law would allow you to harm others. It doesn't become okay just because it's legal. But here's the more serious point. Bob Solomon on Carr says toughness, which for him is the main business virtue, includes knowing how to bluff and when to keep silent, when to be cooperative and when not to be. But such a skill is not, contra Carr, unethical or divorced from ordinary morals. It's a legitimate part of a certain kind of obviously legitimate activity. I think it's worth reflecting on toughness and thinking about what that means in a business context. Solomon says, look, it's one virtue among others, and so there are all sorts of cases where virtues like this come into conflict. Within business, many different kinds of conflicts can arise between the interests of the business or my own personal interests and ethical norms, between ethical and legal norms, between profits and other kinds of constraints. And so within even a virtue ethic, we can think, there are many things here that are relevant. There is a question of prudence and wisdom, but also generosity, kindness, cooperativeness, toughness. All of those things can generate conflicts because we can say, well, this seems like a tough and prudent decision, but on the other hand, it's not very generous. And maybe in the long run, it's unwise. What should I do? And so I think we need to think about this in a broader context, whether or not we view it from the perspective of virtue ethics. Because there is a certain kind of behavior in bargaining contexts that I think most of us admire. It's a toughness, but nevertheless, it's a fair toughness that we view as acceptable and even admirable. But there are other kinds of tactics we view as in some way unfair or manipulative or taking advantage of someone. I've talked a bit about exploitation, but that idea of taking advantage is something that some people do in bargaining contexts. All of us have probably encountered situations, bargaining maybe in a business type context over buying something or selling something, maybe just in terms of a job, but often just in other kind of interpersonal relations, where we've ended up feeling mistreated, where we've ended up feeling taken advantage of, or at least that somebody was trying to take advantage of us. Maybe we walked away and maybe we didn't. But those kinds of contexts are difficult, and I think it's the beginning of an interesting ethical story and not the end of one to say, what are the boundaries? If they shift in these contexts, and Carr is right about that, well, what do they shift to? Where exactly are they now? And how do we resolve those kinds of conflicts that arise? How do we recognize when somebody is taking advantage of someone else and when they are bargaining in a respectful manner? That's worth an inquiry of its own. And so, as I say, that's really the start of the story. Unfortunately, it's also the end of this video.